Okay, so when you're looking at interpretation of accounts, the question itself, it's really important how you set up the question. So do everything you can at the very start to make your life as easy as possible. So what I would say to do, when you get in to the exam and you're looking at the paper, highlight the key figures that you're going to use. So the first thing I would do is I'd have this net profit figure highlighted. I'd have my interest figure and then dividends paid. I'd make a note of that because I'm going to use that quite a bit. Then I'm going to identify what my closing stock is because I need that for one of my liquidity ratios. And then I'd come along here and I'd look at what my ordinary shares are and my preference shares, the 6% preference. And then that capital employed figure, that's going to be used for one of my ratios, my return on capital employed. And that would be my starting point all the time. I would highlight the figures that are going to be necessary there, and then I'd highlight the figures that are going to be necessary from the balance sheet. Next thing I would go and do is I would work out what my ordinary dividend is and my preference dividend, because we regularly use that split. So I'd come back and I'd start my question. Now there are my ratios, don't worry, we'll have a look at those in a few minutes. But I'd start off and I would have my preference dividend. I would find out what that preference dividend is going to be. So using your question, you see that there's 6% preference shares and there are 150,000 preference shares in issue. So you take your 150,000 times 6%. So all you're doing is simply trying to find out what the preference dividend is. So 150,000 by 0.06. So that's 9,000. That is the preference dividend. Then I would come along and I would say, right, my ordinary dividend. What does that have to be? If my preference dividend is 9,000, I look at the ordinary dividend that was paid. Okay, how do I get that ordinary dividend that was paid? I take the dividends figure paid. The total dividend was 18,000. And all I'm doing is coming along and I'm saying 18,000 minus 9,000 gives me an ordinary dividend of 9,000 euro here. So now I have my preference dividend, I have my ordinary dividend, because I do need those quite a bit during the question. Go back to your question then. Is there anything else that you might need that you could miss? And it's usually this market value of one ordinary share. It's normally given to us outside of the question, so we're going to make a note of that. The market value for this particular year. So as a general rule then, anything that's in this little box that's given in the question that I've just highlighted there, all of those ratios need to be spoken about when it comes to Part B, your interpretation. So you know straight off that you're going to have to try and calculate those ratios as we go through it. The question itself is going to guide you in terms of what they want. So they're looking for cash purchases in this case. They're looking for price earnings ratio, the return on shareholders' funds, dividend cover, and gearing. Now, one thing that might be useful to you is if you come along and you say, right, cash purchases. So that's going to be a monetary amount. So put a little euro sign on it. Price earnings ratio, that's going to be in years. So the number of years it would take to recoup the value of the share. The return on shareholders' funds is going to be a percentage. Your dividend cover, it's going to be the number of times that you've covered your dividend. And then your gearing is going to be a percentage. I would have, for myself, anything above 50% is high. Now the reason I'm suggesting you do that is because it gets your mind thinking. Before you ever sit down and try and do the question, you've already broken the ice for yourself, so you're ready to go on that. So that is the very first thing you're going to do for all of these questions when you start off.